The day Dr. James Wilson smiled condescendingly at me across his polished mahogany desk was the day I decided to resurrect the career I'd set aside 5 years ago. "Eleanor," he said, leaning back in his chair with that particular blend of patience and dismissal reserved for women over 50. "These symptoms you're describing, the fatigue, the memory lapses, the joint pain, they're textbook aging. Nothing more." He tapped his pen against my file and added with practiced sympathy, "It happens to everyone eventually. You just need to accept that you're not as young as you used to be." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I sat there in disbelief, my hands trembling slightly in my lap, another symptom he'd conveniently attributed to just getting older. What Dr. Wilson didn't know, what he hadn't bothered to ask about, was that 2 months earlier, I could still swim 40 laps at the community pool without stopping. That my mind had always been razor sharp, cataloging complex neurological cases with precision that had earned me recognition in medical journals. That the progressive, debilitating symptoms I'd been experiencing had started suddenly and were following a pattern I recognized all too well from my 23 years as a practicing neurologist. "Dr. Wilson," I began carefully, emphasizing the title I'd omitted when making the appointment, "I'd like you to order an MRI and complete blood work, including inflammatory markers and thyroid function." I reached into my purse and retrieved my hospital ID card, sliding it across his desk. "I'm Dr. Eleanor Mitchell. I was chief of neurology at Westridge University Medical Center until 5 years ago. This isn't aging. Something is wrong with me, and I need a colleague, not a dismissal." His face transformed, first shock, then embarrassment, followed quickly by defensiveness. All at once, I wasn't just Eleanor Mitchell, 52-year-old woman complaining about getting older. I was Dr. Mitchell, a potential threat to his professional ego and possibly his reputation. That moment changed everything, not just my medical care, but my understanding of what happens when we allow ourselves to be diminished by others' perceptions, even when we should know better. I never intended to step away from medicine. Neurology wasn't just my profession, it was my calling, my identity. By 45, I'd built a reputation as one of the leading diagnostic neurologists in the Northeast. My research on early biomarkers for neurodegenerative diseases had been published in top medical journals. Colleagues sent me their most puzzling cases, and students competed for rotations under my supervision. Medicine was the steady rhythm, underlying my existence, until my parents' health began to fail simultaneously. Mom's Alzheimer's progressed rapidly the same year Dad suffered a major stroke. My brother David lived across the country with his own family, and my sister Claire was dealing with a recent cancer diagnosis. Suddenly, I found myself facing an impossible choice: continue the career I'd spent decades building or be present for the parents who had sacrificed everything for me. In the end, it wasn't really a choice at all. I arranged an extended leave of absence, expecting to return within a year. 1 year stretched into 2, then 3, then 5. Dad stabilized, but required consistent care. Mom's decline was relentless and all-consuming. My colleagues were sympathetic at first, holding my position open, calling to consult on interesting cases. Gradually, though, as often happens, the medical world moved on without me. New research emerged that I barely had time to skim. Former residents I'd trained became department heads. My absence from conferences and hospital corridors slowly erased my professional presence. "You're just taking a break," my friend Diane would reassure me during our monthly lunches at Riverside Coffee Shop. As hospital administrator at Lakeside Medical Center, she kept me loosely connected to the medical community in Glenwood. "When you're ready to come back, doors will open." I wanted to believe her, but as my parents' needs consumed more of my life, doubts crept in. On particularly difficult days, when Mom couldn't remember my name or Dad's frustration with physical therapy erupted into anger, I would retreat to my home office, running my fingers over my framed diplomas and medical awards, wondering if that part of my life was over for good. Then Dad passed away peacefully in his sleep. 6 months later, Mom followed him, finally free from the disease that had stolen her mind piece by piece. I found myself at 52, standing in the sudden quiet of my craftsman home in the old part of town, unmoored from both my family responsibilities and the career that had once defined me. "Now you can focus on yourself again," Diane said when we met for coffee the week after Mom's funeral. "Maybe travel? Date? You've spent years taking care of everyone else." But instead of freedom, I felt a strange hollowness. The structure of caregiving that had replaced my medical career was gone, leaving an unsettling void. I tried to fill it with community volunteer work, book clubs, even a painting class I was embarrassingly terrible at. Nothing quite fit, and then my body began to betray me. It started with fatigue, not the ordinary tiredness after a poor night's sleep, but a bone-deep exhaustion that sleep couldn't touch. I dismissed it as grief, the emotional aftermath of losing both parents within months of each other. But when my usually nimble fingers began dropping things, coffee cups, car keys, the delicate blue teapot Mom had loved, I recognized something was wrong. The joint pain came next, migrating unpredictably. Knees one day, wrists the next, shoulders after that. My morning swim became difficult, then impossible. When memory lapses began, forgetting appointments, losing my train of thought mid-sentence, the neurologist in me grew truly alarmed. These progressive, seemingly unrelated symptoms formed a constellation I recognized from years of clinical practice. Something systemic was happening, possibly autoimmune, potentially serious. That's when I made the appointment with Dr. James Wilson at Lakeside Medical Group. His practice was well regarded, and Diane had mentioned him as one of their promising new physicians. I deliberately didn't use my title when making the appointment. After 5 years away from medicine, I wanted an unbiased assessment, a fresh perspective from a doctor seeing me simply as a patient, not a colleague. In retrospect, I realize I was also testing myself, seeing if I could temporarily set aside the identity of Dr. Mitchell and simply be Eleanor, a woman seeking medical care. It was an experiment that would prove more revealing than I anticipated. The morning of my appointment, I dressed with deliberate casualness, jeans, a simple blouse, and minimal makeup. Nothing that screamed medical professional. I even left my good watch at home, the one engraved by my residence when I was named department chair. In the mirror, I saw what Dr. Wilson would see. A woman in her 50s with silver threading through her dark hair, slight circles under her eyes, and hands that occasionally trembled with a fine tremor. The waiting room at Lakeside Medical Group was modern and impersonal, all sleek surfaces and muted colors. I completed the intake forms methodically, listing my symptoms with clinical precision. When asked for occupation, I hesitated before writing, "retired healthcare professional." Not quite a lie, but not the whole truth either. Eleanor Mitchell? The nurse who called my name was young, efficiently pleasant. She took my vitals with practiced movements, making small talk about the unusually warm spring we were having. My blood pressure was elevated, unusual for me, and I noticed her slight frown as she recorded it. "Dr. Wilson will be with you shortly," she said, leaving me in an exam room decorated with generic landscapes and outdated medical infographics. I recognized one poster about stroke prevention that had been outdated for at least 7 years. Not a good sign. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dr. Wilson kept me waiting 23 minutes. I counted everyone. When he finally entered, he didn't look up from my chart as he introduced himself. He was younger than I expected, probably late 30s, with the polished good looks of someone who'd been told he was handsome too often. His white coat was pristinely pressed, his tie perfectly knotted beneath it. "So, Ms. Mitchell, what brings you in today?" He still hadn't made eye contact, scanning my intake forms instead. "I've been experiencing a progressive set of symptoms. Over the past 3 months," I began, falling into the precise language of my medical training. I described each symptom methodically: the fatigue, joint pain, fine motor difficulties, and cognitive changes. I outlined the progression, the patterns I'd observed, the activities that exacerbated each issue. As I spoke, I watched his expression shift from professional interest to something else, a subtle disengagement, a hint of impatience. He interrupted me mid-sentence. "How old are you, Ms. Mitchell?" 52. He nodded as if this explained everything. "And you say these symptoms have been developing since your parents passed away?" "Yes, but grief can manifest physically, you know, combined with the natural aging process." He trailed off, with a small shrug. I felt a flicker of irritation but pushed it aside. I understand grief can have physical manifestations, but these symptoms follow a neurological and inflammatory pattern that concerns me, particularly the combination of cognitive changes and joint involvement. He smiled, that smile that would later replay in my mind for days. Condescending, patronizing, the smile of a man who had already decided not to take me seriously. "Eleanor," he said, switching to my first name with casual presumption. "I see patients your age all the time with these exact complaints. Our bodies change as we get older. Add significant stress like losing your parents, and it's no wonder you're feeling these effects." "I'd like to rule out more serious conditions," I persisted. "An MRI, comprehensive blood work including inflammatory markers." "I don't think jumping to expensive tests is warranted right now," he cut in smoothly. "Let's start with the basics. I'm going to recommend a mild anti-anxiety medication and suggest you try gentle yoga for the joint pain. Sometimes when we're grieving, we catastrophize normal bodily changes." Catastrophize. The word hung in the air between us. In that moment, I was no longer just frustrated. I was angry. Not only at Dr. Wilson, but at myself. How had I allowed this to happen? How had I, Dr. Eleanor Mitchell, who had trained generations of physicians to listen to their patients, walked into this office and surrendered my authority so completely? That's when I reached for my purse, pulled out my hospital ID, and slid it across his desk. The moment I revealed my medical credentials, the power dynamic in the room shifted palpably. Dr. Wilson blinked rapidly, suddenly seeing me through a different lens. He straightened in his chair, tugging slightly at his tie. I apologize, Dr. Mitchell. I didn't realize." "That shouldn't matter," I said quietly, finding my professional voice again. "Every patient deserves to have their concerns taken seriously, regardless of their credentials." His face flushed. "Of course. You're absolutely right." He cleared his throat, visibly recalibrating. "Let's order those tests you mentioned. The MRI, comprehensive labs. We should absolutely rule out any underlying conditions." In that moment, I felt a complex mix of emotions: satisfaction at being taken seriously, disappointment that it required my credentials, and a deep concern about what this meant for other patients sitting in the same chair without an MD after their name. "Thank you," I said, retrieving my ID card. "And I'd like a referral to Dr. Thomas Chen in neurology at Memorial Hospital. He was my colleague years ago." Dr. Wilson nodded eagerly, now almost deferential. "Of course. I'll have my nurse set that up right away." As I left his office that day, prescription for lab work and imaging in hand, I felt something stirring within me. A sense of purpose I hadn't experienced since stepping away from medicine. This interaction had illuminated something important, something I couldn't simply walk away from. In the hospital parking lot, I sat in my car without starting the engine, thinking about what had just happened. Would Dr. Wilson treat his next 50-something female patient with more respect? Or was this change in behavior solely because of my MD? My mind drifted to all the patients, especially women, especially older adults, whose symptoms might be dismissed as anxiety, stress, or simply aging. I thought about my mother in her early stages of Alzheimer's, when her legitimate concerns were brushed off by her first doctor as senior moments. How many diagnoses were missed or delayed because patients lacked the medical vocabulary or professional status to advocate for themselves? My phone buzzed with a text from Diane. "How'd the appointment go?" I stared at the message, unsure how to encapsulate what had just happened and the thoughts now churning in my mind. Finally, I typed, "It's complicated. Are you free for dinner?" "Tonight? I may need your perspective on something." "Riverview Bistro at 7?" she suggested. "Perfect," I replied, finally starting my car. As I drove home, memories of my medical career flickered through my mind. Challenging cases, grateful patients, the residents I'd mentored. For 5 years, I'd told myself that chapter was closed, that stepping away from medicine to care for my parents meant my professional life was over. But maybe that wasn't true. Maybe there was another way to use my medical knowledge and experience. At home, I went straight to my office, a room I'd avoided since Mom's passing. Dust had settled on the medical textbooks lining the shelves and the framed research articles on the walls. I opened my laptop and for the first time in years, logged into the medical journal database I'd maintained my subscription to but rarely used. I began researching current diagnostic protocols for the symptoms I was experiencing. Medical knowledge evolves rapidly, and I needed to update my understanding. 3 hours later, surrounded by notes and printouts, I felt more like myself than I had in years. The medical detective was back, starting with my own case, but already thinking beyond it. When I met Diane at Riverview Bistro that evening, she noticed the change immediately. "Something's different," she said, studying my face across the table. "You seem energized." I recounted my experience with Dr. Wilson, the dismissal, the revelation of my credentials, the sudden change in his approach. As hospital administrator, Diane had heard similar stories before, but this one hit closer to home. "It's not just about me," I explained, picking at my barely touched salmon. "I keep thinking about all the patients who don't have the advantage of medical training, who don't know what questions to ask or when to push back." Diane nodded thoughtfully. "So, what are you thinking?" I took a deep breath, giving voice to the idea that had been forming since I left Dr. Wilson's office. "I'm thinking it might be time for me to come back to medicine, but differently. Not returning to clinical practice exactly, but I don't know. Patient advocacy, education, something that addresses this gap I experienced firsthand today." "Interesting," Diane said, leaning forward. "You know, we've been discussing implementing a patient advocate program at Lakeside. The board is supportive, but we haven't found the right person to develop it." Our conversation continued late into the evening, possibilities unfolding between us. By the time we parted, something had crystallized within me. A new direction that would build on my medical expertise, while addressing a critical need I now understood from both sides of the stethoscope. The next morning, I received a call from Dr. Wilson's office. My MRI was scheduled for the following week, blood work could be done immediately, and Dr. Chen had agreed to see me the day after my imaging. The efficiency was striking, and I couldn't help wondering if other patients received the same prompt attention. As I prepared for these appointments, gathering my medical records and noting my symptoms with renewed clinical precision, I felt a strange gratitude for Dr. Wilson's dismissal. That moment of being diminished, of having my concerns brushed aside with a condescending smile, had awakened something I thought I'd lost. My path forward wasn't clear yet, but for the first time since my parents' passing, I felt a sense of purpose returning. Whatever was happening with my health, and I was still determined to get answers, it had already led me to an unexpected turning point. That dismissive encounter across a mahogany desk was becoming the catalyst for my next chapter, one where the title doctor would serve not just me, but all those who found themselves unheard in examination rooms just like that one. I picked up my phone and called Diane. "About that patient advocate program," I said when she answered. "I'd like to hear more." The waiting room at Memorial Hospital's neurology department brought back a flood of memories. The gentle hum of fluorescent lights, the faint antiseptic smell, the hushed conversations. It was both familiar and strange, like returning to a childhood home now occupied by someone else. I found myself automatically scanning the credentials on the wall, noting the updated treatment protocols posted near the nurse's station, evaluating the newer diagnostic equipment visible through open doorways. 5 years suddenly felt like both a moment and an eternity. "Eleanor Mitchell?" The nurse who called my name did a double take, recognition dawning. "Dr. Mitchell, I trained under you during my first year." "Karen Reynolds. I was on your stroke team rotation." I smiled, placing her now. "Karen, of course. You were brilliant with patient education. How are you?" "I'm great. But what are you doing in the waiting room? Are you consulting on a case?" Her confusion was understandable. The last time she'd seen me, I'd been leading rounds, not sitting among patients clutching a file folder. "Actually, I'm here as a patient. I have an appointment with Dr. Chen." Karen's expression shifted, subtly, concern mixed with professional composure. "Of course. Let me take you back right away." As she led me through corridors I once navigated daily, I noticed her careful sideways glances, the gentle way she steadied my elbow when my gait faltered slightly. I wondered what she saw, the respected neurologist she remembered, or just another middle-aged woman with unexplained symptoms? Both, perhaps. The duality was becoming my new normal. Thomas Chen hadn't changed much in 5 years, still the same meticulous posture, the same wire-rimmed glasses, the same habit of tapping his pen against his thumb when deep in thought. What had changed was how he looked at me. Where once there had been collegial respect between equals, now there was something else. Clinical assessment mixed with personal concern. "Eleanor," he said warmly, rising to embrace me briefly before gesturing to a chair. "It's been too long." 5 years? 3 months, I replied. Mom's diagnosis was just after that neuroanatomy conference in Boston. I remember. He settled behind his desk, placing my file before him. "I was sorry to hear about your parents, and now you're dealing with your own health concerns." I appreciated that he didn't call me Dr. Mitchell or emphasize our previous professional relationship. Thomas had always understood nuance. It was why we'd worked so well together on complicated cases. "I've reviewed your MRI results and blood work," he said, turning his monitor so we could both see the screen. "I can understand why you're concerned. There are several findings here worth discussing." For the next 45 minutes, we analyzed my test results together, not as doctor and patient, but as 2 neurologists consulting on a case. The MRI showed small but significant areas of demyelination in my central nervous system. My blood work revealed elevated inflammatory markers and the presence of specific antibodies associated with autoimmune disorders. "Classic presentation for early MS," I said quietly, naming the diagnosis we were both considering. "One possibility," Thomas agreed cautiously. "But there are other autoimmune conditions that could present similarly. We should do a lumbar puncture to check for oligoclonal bands in your cerebrospinal fluid. And I'd like to consult with Dr. Liesel Harmon in immunology. She's doing groundbreaking work on neurological manifestations of autoimmune disorders." I nodded, feeling a strange disconnect between the clinical discussion and the realization that we were talking about my body, my future, my life. Multiple sclerosis would explain the constellation of symptoms, the fatigue, cognitive changes, motor difficulties. "Eleanor," Thomas said gently, setting down his pen. I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer as my patient, not as a fellow neurologist. Are you prepared for what this diagnostic journey might reveal? Whatever we find, this isn't a case study. It's your health. The question caught me off guard. Throughout my career, I'd maintained professional distance, analyzing symptoms, ordering tests, delivering diagnoses with compassionate detachment. Now the clinical and personal were inseparably merged. I don't know, I admitted, my voice smaller than I intended. Part of me keeps analyzing everything with clinical precision. Another part hasn't fully processed that this is happening to me. Thomas nodded understandingly. It's a unique challenge for medical professionals when we become patients. We know too much and sometimes not enough. He scheduled my lumbar puncture for the following day and arranged a consultation with Dr. Harmon later that week. As I gathered my things to leave, he placed a hand briefly on my shoulder. Eleanor, whatever we discover, you're not facing it alone. You have colleagues who respect you, friends who care about you. He hesitated, then added, and you have your own formidable medical knowledge. Just don't let the doctor in you silence the patient who deserves to be heard. His words stayed with me as I drove home through Glenwood's tree-lined streets. The doctor and the patient, the observer and the observed, the knower and the known. These dualities had suddenly become the framework of my existence. At home, I found myself doing what any neurologist would do, and what no neurologist would recommend. I spent hours researching every possible diagnosis that matched my symptoms and test results, calculating probability percentages, reviewing treatment protocols and long-term outcomes. My dining table disappeared under printed journal articles, medical reference books pulled from shelves, and pages of my own meticulous notes. When my phone rang around midnight, I answered without checking the caller ID, half expecting it to be Thomas with some new insight about my case. Eleanor, are you still awake? It was Diane, concern evident in her voice. I've been thinking about our conversation about the patient advocate position. I glanced at the clock, surprised by the late hour. I'm up, just doing some reading. Medical journals at midnight? Some things never change, she said with affection in her voice. Listen, I spoke with the board today. They're interested in meeting with you about developing the advocacy program. No pressure, but if you're serious about it, this could be perfect timing. In the midst of my own medical uncertainty, the opportunity felt both perfectly timed and impossibly complicated. How could I advocate for others when my own health was in question? Yet, perhaps that was exactly why I should do it, because I now understood both sides of the medical divide in ways few could. I'd like to meet with them, I said finally. But Diane, I should tell you, I'm in the middle of some diagnostic testing. There's a possibility I'm facing a significant health challenge. The line went quiet for a moment. All the more reason for you to be involved in this program if you're up to it. You'd bring perspective no one else can. After we hung up, I stepped away from my research spread and moved to the kitchen window. The neighborhood was dark, except for a few scattered porch lights and the occasional passing car. 5 years ago, my life had been consumed by hospital, rounds, research deadlines, and medical conferences. Then it had narrowed to the intimate world of caregiving, medication schedules, physical therapy appointments, the daily rhythms of my parents' needs. Now I stood at another threshold, my future once again uncertain. The lumbar puncture the next day was a strange experience, being on the receiving end of a procedure I'd ordered countless times for my own patients. I found myself talking the young resident through it, suggesting a slight adjustment in needle. Angle when he encountered resistance, then falling silent at Thomas's gentle headshake. Patient, not doctor. It was a boundary I was still learning to navigate. Afterward, as I lay flat to prevent the headache that often follows the procedure, A nurse I didn't recognize brought me ginger ale and saltines. Dr. Chen said you'd probably skip the recommended rest period if left to your own devices, she explained with a knowing smile. He's ordered me to make sure you stay horizontal for at least an hour. I smiled back, surrendering to the required rest. Thomas knows me too well. He speaks very highly of you, she said, checking my IV. Says you were the best diagnostician he ever worked with. Were. Past tense. The word landed heavily, despite her kind intention. The next 3 days passed in a blur of additional tests, consultations, and mounting anticipation. I met with Dr. Harmon, whose brilliant mind and straightforward manner immediately earned my respect. Together with Thomas, we reviewed my comprehensive test results, including the lumbar puncture that confirmed the presence of oligoclonal bands in my cerebrospinal fluid, a finding consistent with multiple sclerosis. The good news, Dr. Harmon explained, is that we've caught this early. The demyelination is minimal, and with current treatment protocols, we can likely slow progression significantly. And the cognitive symptoms? I asked, voicing my deepest fear as a neurologist. Memory and clarity of thought had always been my most valued tools. Often manageable with the right medication approach, Thomas assured me. And some of what you're experiencing could be related to stress and sleep disruption, rather than direct neurological effects. We discussed treatment options, potential side effects, and lifestyle modifications. Throughout the conversation, I toggled between absorbing the information as a patient making life-altering decisions and analyzing it as a neurologist evaluating a treatment plan. The duality was exhausting. I'll need some time to consider the options, I said finally. Of course, Thomas agreed. But Eleanor, don't wait too long. Early intervention makes a significant difference in outcomes. As I left Memorial Hospital, that afternoon, treatment protocols in hand, I felt strangely liberated despite the serious diagnosis. There was clarity in naming the enemy, in understanding what I was facing. The uncertainty that had haunted me for months had solidified into something tangible, something I could research, understand, and fight. My phone buzzed with a text from Diane. Board meeting tomorrow at 10 a.m. if you're still interested. No pressure. I hesitated only briefly before replying. I'll be there. That evening, as I organized my research into a coherent treatment decision framework, my doorbell rang unexpectedly. Through the peephole, I saw a face I didn't immediately recognize, a woman perhaps in her early 40s, clutching a small gift bag and looking nervous. When I opened the door, she smiled tentatively. Dr. Mitchell, I'm Sophia Garcia. We met briefly in Dr. Wilson's waiting room last week. I overheard your conversation with him. The memory clicked into place. A woman with a concerned expression, who had been sitting across from me, pretending to read a magazine while clearly listening to my increasingly frustrated exchanges with the receptionist about getting my test results. Please come in, I offered, curious about this unexpected visit. Sophia followed me to the living room, perching anxiously on the edge of my sofa. I hope this isn't inappropriate, she began, twisting a silver bracelet around her wrist. The receptionist wouldn't tell me your contact information, of course, but I recognized your name from an article in the medical journal my sister subscribes to. She's a nurse at Lakeside. I took a chance that you might be in the phone book. People still use phone books? I asked with gentle humor, trying to put her at ease. She smiled briefly. Online version. I'm not quite that old-fashioned. She handed me the small gift bag. I wanted to thank you. Inside was a beautiful hand-thrown ceramic mug with Trust Your Instincts painted in flowing script. Thank me? I don't understand. Sophia took a deep breath. After I heard you confront Dr. Wilson, when you showed him your medical degree, and insisted on those tests, it gave me courage. I've been having similar symptoms for over a year. Fatigue, joint pain, cognitive fog. 3 different doctors told me it was stress, perimenopause, or depression. One prescribed antidepressants without even ordering basic blood work. My anger flared at this all-too-familiar story. "And after you witnessed my appointment?" "I went back the next day and demanded the same tests you had mentioned. I wouldn't leave until Dr. Wilson agreed." Her eyes welled with tears. "The results showed Hashimoto's thyroiditis, an autoimmune disorder that was causing all my symptoms. I started treatment yesterday." I sat back, momentarily speechless. While I'd been focused on my own diagnosis, my confrontation with Dr. Wilson had created ripples I never anticipated. "Your courage changed my life," Sophia continued. "If I hadn't heard you advocate for yourself that day, I might have given up, accepted that it was all in my head or just part of getting older." "I'm so glad you pushed for answers," I said, genuinely moved. "But the courage was yours. You're the one who went back and advocated for yourself." "Because I saw it was possible." She hesitated, then added, "My sister mentioned there might be other women like me, people whose symptoms are dismissed because of age or gender, or because they don't have the medical vocabulary to challenge their doctors." She thought, "Maybe you could help somehow." Something crystallized in that moment, a vision of how my medical knowledge, teaching experience, and now personal patient journey could converge into something meaningful. The patient advocacy program Diane had mentioned suddenly seemed not just possible, but necessary. After Sophia left, I stayed up late preparing for the board meeting. By morning, I had a comprehensive proposal outlining a 3-tiered patient advocacy program that would include education, direct support services, and systemic change initiatives within Lakeside Medical Center. The board meeting went better than I could have hoped. My presentation was met with enthusiastic support, particularly when I shared Sophia's story, with her permission, and hinted at my own recent experiences as a patient navigating the system. "We'd like to offer you the position of Director of Patient Advocacy and Education," the board chair announced at the conclusion of the meeting. "Your unique perspective as both a highly respected physician and someone who has experienced the patient side of care makes you ideally suited to develop this program." I accepted with one condition, that I could structure my schedule to accommodate my own ongoing medical treatment. I didn't specify the diagnosis, but I was clear about needing flexibility. To my relief, this was readily granted. As I left the administrative wing of Lakeside Medical Center with a new title, office assignment, and sense of purpose, I nearly collided with Dr. James Wilson coming around a corner, arms full of patient files. "Dr. Mitchell," he said, recognition and immediate discomfort flickering across his face. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I'll be around quite a bit from now on," I replied evenly. "I've just accepted a position as Director of Patient Advocacy." The files in his arms seemed to become suddenly heavier. "I see. Well, congratulations." I could have left it at that, a brief professional acknowledgement before continuing on my way. But something compelled me to pause. "Dr. Wilson, I'd like to meet with you next week if you're available. There's a patient-centered communication workshop I'm developing, and I'd value your input." His surprise was evident. He'd clearly expected confrontation, not collaboration. "My input? After our previous interaction?" "Especially because of it," I said honestly. "That appointment was a turning point for me in several ways. And I understand you've since diagnosed a patient with Hashimoto's thyroiditis who might otherwise have gone untreated." Comprehension dawned on his face. "Ms. Garcia, yes, she came in quite determined after your visit. Sometimes determination is what's needed when something's wrong." From both doctor and patient. He nodded slowly. "I have time Tuesday afternoon if that works for you." As we confirmed the details and parted ways, I reflected on how differently I felt walking these hospital corridors now compared to that first visit to Thomas's office. I moved through the space not as the esteemed Dr. Mitchell returning to reclaim past glory, nor as a diminished patient seeking help, but as something new, a physician who had crossed the divide between provider and recipient of care, and found purpose in the journey between worlds. That evening, I began my first dose of disease-modifying therapy for MS. The medication that would hopefully slow the progression of my condition came in an auto-injector pen with clear instructions. As I administered the subcutaneous injection, I thought about the thousands of patients I'd treated over my career. Had I ever fully understood their experience? The vulnerability, the hope, the trust placed in both the science and the healthcare providers interpreting it? My phone chimed with a text from Thomas. "How did it go?" "First dose done," I replied. "Easier than I expected." "Most things are," came his response. "Dinner tomorrow? I'd like to hear about this new position of yours." I smiled at the invitation. Thomas had always been more than a colleague, a friend, a respected peer, someone who saw me clearly. Now he was also my neurologist, adding another layer to our complex relationship. "Dinner sounds perfect," I texted back. Later that night, I sat at my kitchen table, organizing materials for my first official day as patient advocacy director. My diagnosis paperwork lay alongside patient education brochures I was reviewing, treatment calendars beside program development, timelines. The irony wasn't lost on me, launching a career focused on patient empowerment just as I began my own journey as a patient with a chronic condition. I picked up the mug Sophia had given me, running my fingers over the words, "Trust. Your instincts." 5 years ago, my instincts had led me to step away from medicine to care for my parents. Now, they were guiding me back, not to the same role, but to something that honored both my medical expertise and my newly acquired perspective from the other side of healthcare. My phone rang, displaying Diane's name. "I heard the board meeting." "Was a success," she said when I answered. "Director of Patient Advocacy has a nice ring to it." "It feels right," I admitted, "though the timing is complicated." "Because of your diagnosis?" Diane asked gently. After the board meeting, I'd shared the details of my MS diagnosis with her over lunch. "Partly. But I'm also still figuring out who I am now. Not quite the same doctor I was before. Definitely. Not just a patient." "Maybe that's exactly why you're the right person for this role," Diane suggested. "You understand the system from both sides. You speak both languages." After we hung up, I moved to my study and looked at the wall of medical credentials that had once been the primary markers of my identity. Among them now hung a simple ceramic mug and a patient appointment card for my next neurology follow-up. New, badges of a different kind of expertise. The next morning, I woke with more energy than I'd felt in months. Whether from the medication beginning its work or the purpose that now animated my days, I couldn't tell. Perhaps both. I dressed carefully for my first official day, choosing a professional outfit that accommodated the new physical realities of my condition, comfortable shoes for balance issues, layers for the temperature sensitivity, fabrics that wouldn't irritate increasingly sensitive skin. As I prepared to leave, my gaze fell on the small table by my front door where I'd always kept my hospital ID badge during my years as a practicing neurologist. The space had been empty since I'd stepped away from medicine. Now a new badge lay there. Dr. Eleanor Mitchell, Director of Patient Advocacy and Education. I picked it up, feeling its weight, lighter than my old neurology department badge, but somehow carrying more significance now. 5 years ago, I'd walked away from medicine to honor my commitment to family. Today, I was walking back toward a different version of my calling, carrying with me not just my medical knowledge, but the profound understanding that comes only from experiencing both sides of healthcare. The badge slipped easily onto my lapel, a familiar weight in a new position. Whatever challenges lay ahead, managing my condition, building a meaningful program, navigating the complex politics of healthcare, I faced them with a uniquely dual perspective. I was both the doctor who could decipher complex medical information and the patient who understood the fear of facing an uncertain prognosis. Both the insider who knew how hospitals functioned and the outsider who had experienced their shortcomings. As I locked my front door and headed toward my car, I thought about Dr. Wilson's dismissive smile, the catalyst that had unexpectedly opened this new chapter. I thought about Thomas's steady support, Diane's pragmatic friendship, and Sophia's ceramic mug with its simple truism. I thought about my parents, whose needs had pulled me away from medicine, and whose absence had created space for this new iteration of my professional life. The morning sun cast long shadows across my driveway as I began the drive to Lakeside Medical Center. I was Dr. Eleanor Mitchell, neurologist with an MS diagnosis, patient advocate with medical credentials. Neither role diminished the other. Instead, they created something more powerful in combination than either could be alone. Sometimes the most valuable perspective comes from standing in two worlds simultaneously. And sometimes dismissing someone's concerns leads to consequences you never anticipated. Like a highly qualified neurologist showing up with her medical degree and a determination to change the system from within. My new office at Lakeside Medical Center still smelled of fresh paint and untouched potential. The walls were institutional beige, awaiting personal touches, and the furniture had that generic functionality common to hospital administrative spaces. But the large window overlooking the healing garden offered natural light that transformed the otherwise unremarkable room. I arranged my medical reference books on the empty shelves, placed a small potted peace lily on the windowsill, a housewarming gift from Diane, and hung my diplomas and certifications on the wall facing my desk. The final touch was Sophia's ceramic mug, which I positioned prominently on my desk where both I and any visitors would see it. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. Academic achievements sharing space with a patient's gift, both equally valued. It reflected the bridge I was attempting to build between the clinical and personal aspects of healthcare. A knock at my open door interrupted my arranging. Marcus Reed stood in the doorway, arms crossed, expression unreadable. We had trained together decades ago, rising through the ranks of neurology side by side before our paths diverged, me to academic medicine, him to private practice. When I'd stepped away to care for my parents, Marcus had expanded his practice significantly, becoming something of a local medical celebrity with regular television appearances discussing brain health in ways that made most neurologists cringe. "The prodigal neurologist returns," he said, his tone making it impossible to discern if he meant it as a friendly joke or subtle jab. "Marcus, it's been a while. 5 years, give or take." He stepped into my office uninvited, glancing around with a critical eye. "Patient advocacy director. Interesting career pivot. It's where I can be most useful right now." His gaze settled on my credentials wall. "I heard rumors you were dealing with health issues yourself. Nothing serious, I hope?" The question carried the familiar veneer of professional concern that thinly masked medical curiosity. I'd used the same tone myself when inquiring about colleagues' ailments, part genuine care, part clinical interest in the case. "I've been diagnosed with relapsing remitting MS," I said simply, choosing transparency over evasion. "Early stages, good prognosis with treatment." Something flickered across his face, surprise at my candor perhaps, or professional assessment of what this diagnosis meant for a fellow neurologist. "Chen is handling your case?" "Yes, along with Liesl Harmon in immunology." Marcus nodded approvingly. "Good team, though I've had excellent results with an experimental protocol from Switzerland. I could send you the research if you're interested." Before I could respond, my phone rang. Diane, calling about the patient advocacy program's first interdepartmental meeting scheduled for that afternoon. I excused myself to take the call, and Marcus took the hint, departing with a promise to catch up properly soon. After he left, I sat at my desk feeling unsettled. Marcus had always been competitive, even during our residency days. But there was something new in his manner, a subtle condescension, as if my new role and diagnosis somehow diminished me in his eyes. It was reminiscent of James Wilson's initial dismissal of my symptoms, though coming from a longtime colleague, it stung differently. I pushed the thought aside and focused on preparing for the afternoon meeting. The Patient Advocacy Program would require buy-in from department heads across the hospital, many of whom might view patient empowerment initiatives as implicit criticism of their current practices, or worse, potential liabilities waiting to happen. I needed to position the program as a collaborative enhancement to existing care, not an oversight mechanism or complaint department. The conference room was already half filled when I arrived. Department heads and senior administrators engaged in pre-meeting small talk. I recognized most faces, some from my previous tenure at neighboring Memorial Hospital, others from medical conferences or community events. As I set up my presentation materials, I felt the weight of evaluating gazes. Word of my diagnosis had clearly spread through the medical grapevine with predictable efficiency. Diane arrived last, bringing the hospital's chief of medicine, Dr. Harold Winters, with her. At 72, Harold was a living institution in Glenwood's medical community, renowned for his clinical acumen, respected for his ethical leadership, and occasionally feared for his unflinching standards. He had been chief when I completed my residency, and his recommendation had helped launch my academic career. "Eleanor," he said warmly, clasping my hand in both of his. "When Diane told me you were returning to medicine in this capacity, I postponed my fishing trip. This program is exactly what Lakeside needs, and there's no one better equipped to develop it." His public endorsement immediately shifted the energy in the room. If Harold Winters supported the initiative, opposition would be minimal, at least overtly. The meeting proceeded better than I had dared hope. My presentation outlined the 3 components of the planned program. First, a patient education initiative that would provide accessible information about conditions, treatments, and what questions to ask. Second, direct advocacy services for patients struggling to navigate complex care decisions or experiencing communication breakdowns with providers. And third, a feedback loop to improve systemic issues identified through the first 2 components. "This isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame," I emphasized, addressing the unspoken concern in the room. "It's about recognizing that healthcare is increasingly complex, and patients often lack the tools to participate effectively in their own care decisions." "And how exactly would this feedback mechanism work?" asked Dr. Sanjay Patel, head of cardiology. "Are we talking about evaluations of individual physicians?" The question cut to the heart of the resistance I'd anticipated. No physician welcomes the prospect of having their clinical decisions or communication style scrutinized, especially by a colleague. The focus would be on identifying patterns and systemic issues, not individual performance reviews, I clarified. For example, if we notice multiple patients reporting confusion about discharge instructions from a particular service, we'd work with that department to improve their communication materials, not single out specific doctors. Harold nodded approvingly. I'd add that this program offers protection for physicians as well. Clear communication and educated patients lead to better compliance, fewer complications, and ultimately, reduced liability concerns. By meeting's end, I had preliminary commitments from each department to designate a liaison to the advocacy program and to participate in the initial training workshops. Even the most skeptical seemed cautiously supportive, with one exception. Marcus, representing neurology, had remained conspicuously silent throughout, his expression inscrutable. As the room cleared, he approached my table. "Impressive presentation. Very diplomatic." "But," I prompted, sensing his reservation, "but I wonder if you've fully considered how this program might be perceived. Some might see it as leveraging your personal health situation for professional advancement." The insinuation took me aback. That's not what this is about, Marcus. Isn't it? The timing is interesting. Stepping away from clinical practice after your diagnosis, then creating a position that doesn't require the physical stamina of patient care, a position where your condition won't interfere. His words struck with precision, targeting a vulnerability I hadn't fully acknowledged even to myself. Was there truth in his assessment? Had I chosen this path partly because I feared my diagnosis would eventually impact my ability to practice clinical neurology? My medical status informs my perspective but doesn't define my professional contributions, I replied evenly. And the stamina required for effective patient advocacy shouldn't be underestimated. Marcus raised his hands in mock surrender, just offering a perspective, as a friend. As he walked away, Diane approached, having overheard the exchange. Don't let him get to you. Marcus has been angling for Harold's position when he retires. Any initiative with Harold's blessing is a threat to his ambitions. It's not just that, I said quietly. There's some truth in what he's suggesting, even if his framing is self-serving. Diane gave me a knowing look. Everyone's motivations are complex, Eleanor. Yes, your diagnosis influenced your interest in patient advocacy. That's precisely what makes you effective in this role. It doesn't diminish the value of what you're building. Her words stayed with me as I returned to my office, sorting through department liaison nominations and scheduling the first round of training sessions. By late afternoon, fatigue began setting in, one of my MS symptoms that typically intensified as the day progressed. I had just decided to finish the remaining paperwork at home when there was another knock at my door. James Wilson stood there, looking considerably less confident than during our first encounter. Dr. Mitchell, do you have a moment? I gestured for him to enter, curious about this unexpected visit. He sat awkwardly in the chair across from my desk, fingers fidgeting with his tie clip. I've been reflecting on our initial appointment, he began, and subsequent events. I owe you an apology for dismissing your concerns. Thank you for saying that, I replied, genuinely appreciative of what I knew must be a difficult conversation for a young physician. It's more than just professional courtesy, he continued. Since your appointment and Ms. Garcia's follow-up visit, I've been reviewing my approach with other patients, particularly women over 40. He hesitated. I've identified some concerning patterns in my diagnostic reasoning. His candor surprised me. Most physicians, confronted with evidence of their biases, become defensive rather than introspective. What kind of patterns? Attributing physical symptoms to psychological causes more readily in female patients, dismissing complaints that fit age-related stereotypes without adequate investigation, spending less time on patient history for certain demographic groups. He met my gaze directly. Basic cognitive biases that I didn't believe influenced my practice until I started monitoring my own decision-making processes. I leaned forward, intrigued by his self-awareness. What prompted this level of self-examination? Honestly, embarrassment initially. Being caught underestimating a neurologist wasn't my proudest moment. A hint of rueful smile crossed his face. But then I had 3 cases in rapid succession. All women, all with legitimate medical conditions I nearly missed because I classified their symptoms as stress or age-related without adequate testing. And now? Now I'm concerned about how many cases I might have mishandled before someone with your credentials called me out. He straightened in his chair. That's actually why I'm here. I'd like to be involved in your advocacy program, specifically helping develop protocols to address diagnostic bias, if you're willing to work with me. The request was unexpected but perfectly aligned with the program's goals. I think that could be valuable, Dr. Wilson, though it would require continued transparency about your own learning process. James, please. And yes, I understand. I'm prepared to share my experience if it helps shift the culture. As he left my office with plans to meet the following week, I reflected on the unlikely alliance forming between us. When I'd confronted him in his office, showing him my medical degree in a moment of frustrated self-advocacy, I couldn't have imagined he would become one of the first physicians to actively support the advocacy program. That evening, as I drove home through the golden light of late afternoon, I found myself thinking about transformation, how moments of conflict or crisis can catalyze unexpected growth. James confronting his biases, Marcus revealing his insecurities, me finding purpose in the very diagnosis that had initially seemed like an ending. The thought carried me through my evening routine, taking medication, preparing a simple dinner, reviewing materials for the next day's meetings. As I worked at my dining table, my phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. "How was first official day? Still on for follow-up appointment Thursday?" I smiled at his thoughtfulness. "Eventful in good ways. And yes, for Thursday." Another message appeared moments later. "Dinner after? Harold mentioned your advocacy program launch. Want to hear details?" The invitation warmed me. Thomas had always been more than a colleague, a friend whose intellectual companionship I had missed during my years away from medicine. Now, as both my treating neurologist and a professional peer, our relationship was evolving into something I couldn't quite define but deeply valued. "Dinner sounds perfect," I replied. Over the next 2 weeks, the patient advocacy program took shape with surprising momentum. The liaison committee met twice, department-specific training sessions were scheduled, and patient education materials began development. Harold became an unexpected champion, leveraging his considerable influence to secure additional funding and resources. Throughout this period, I maintained my own treatment regimen: medication, physical therapy, cognitive exercises recommended by Thomas. Most days, I managed my symptoms effectively, pacing myself and adapting my schedule to accommodate the fluctuating energy levels characteristic of MS. But the disease occasionally reminded me of its presence with sharp clarity, as it did during our third liaison committee meeting. I was midway through presenting a patient education protocol when my vision suddenly blurred, words on my notes swimming incomprehensibly before me. A wave of dizziness followed, forcing me to grip the edge of the podium. The symptoms of an MS flare I had been fighting off for days had finally broken through. "Dr. Mitchell?" Diane's voice seemed to come from far away. "Are you all right?" I took a deep breath, focusing on remaining upright. "I need a brief recess," I managed to say. 5 minutes. Harold was at my side immediately, discreetly guiding me from the room with the practiced ease of a physician who had handled countless medical situations. In the privacy of a nearby office, he helped me to a chair and efficiently assessed my condition. "MS flare?" he asked, his clinical gaze noting my uneven pupils and slight facial asymmetry. I nodded, frustrated by this public manifestation of my condition. "I've been pushing too hard. Thomas warned me about stress as a trigger." Harold poured a glass of water and handed it to me, then sat beside me rather than across the desk. Subtle shift from medical authority to supportive colleague. "I was 62 when my Parkinson's was diagnosed," he said quietly. "Tried to hide the tremor for months. Performed surgeries until my hand became too unreliable, then switched to diagnostic work." I looked at him with new understanding. I had known about his Parkinson's diagnosis, of course. It was common knowledge in medical circles. But I had never considered the personal and professional recalibration it must have required. "How did you handle the transition?" I asked. "Poorly at first. Fought it, denied it, overcompensated." A wry smile crossed his face. "Then I realized my most valuable contribution wasn't in my surgical skill, but in my accumulated knowledge and judgment. I became a better teacher, a more attentive diagnostician, and eventually a more effective administrator than I had ever been as a surgeon. The parallel to my situation wasn't lost on me." "You adapted." "I transformed," He corrected gently. There's a difference. Adaptation is passive, making do with changed circumstances. Transformation is active, creating new purpose from new realities. His words resonated deeply. Wasn't that exactly what I was attempting with the advocacy program? Not merely adapting to my diagnosis, as Marcus had insinuated, but transforming my combined physician and patient experiences into something uniquely valuable? The committee can wait, Harold said, checking his watch. Take the time you need. But I was already feeling steadier, the symptoms receding to manageable levels. I'd rather continue, with transparency. When we returned to the conference room, concerned faces greeted us. Rather than ignoring what had happened, I addressed it directly. As some of you know, I was recently diagnosed with MS. I said calmly. What you just witnessed was a mild flare triggered by overexertion. I apologize for the interruption, but I hope this moment can serve our larger purpose. Healthcare happens to healthcare providers too. None of us is immune to becoming a patient. And when that happens, our perspective necessarily shifts. The tension in the room dissolved, replaced by a new quality of attention. For the remainder of the meeting, contributions seemed more authentic, less guarded. Even Marcus participated more constructively, sharing insights from his neurology patients' experiences, navigating complex care decisions. Later that afternoon, Sophia Garcia appeared at my office for our scheduled meeting. Since our initial conversation, she had become an unofficial consultant to the advocacy program, sharing her perspective as a patient whose legitimate symptoms had been repeatedly dismissed. You look tired, she observed as she settled into the chair across from me. Rough day. Revealing day, I corrected. Had an MS flare during a committee meeting. Ended up being unexpectedly educational for everyone involved. Sophia nodded, understandingly. Living the mission statement. She pulled a folder from her bag. I've been thinking about that patient education initiative we discussed. The materials hospitals typically provide are either too simplified or too technical. There's rarely a middle ground for patients who want substantial information without a medical degree. She spread several prototype pamphlets across my desk, patient education materials she had redesigned, incorporating medical information at appropriate depth while removing unnecessary jargon. The work was impressive, reflecting both intelligence and first-hand understanding of the patient experience. These are excellent, I said, genuinely impressed. You have a background in technical communication? Instructional design. I develop training programs for software companies. She hesitated. At least I did, until my symptoms made consistent work impossible. Now I freelance when I'm able. An idea began forming, a potential expansion of the advocacy program I hadn't initially envisioned. Would you be interested in consulting on our patient education materials? Paid position, project-based to accommodate your health fluctuations? Her eyes widened. Are you serious? I'd love that. Your perspective would be invaluable. Someone who understands both effective communication principles and the patient experience firsthand. I made a note in my calendar. Let me speak with Diane about budget allocation. I think we could create a small team of patient consultants with varied backgrounds and conditions. By the time Sophia left my office, the concept had solidified into a concrete proposal, a patient consultant panel that would review educational materials, provide feedback on hospital processes, and serve as a reality check on initiatives, developed by well-meaning but sometimes insulated healthcare professionals. I was adding final notes to the proposal when Thomas called. How are you feeling? Harold mentioned you had a flare today. News travels fast, I said, unsurprised. I'm better now, just needed rest and hydration. I'd like to move up your follow-up appointment to tomorrow if you can manage it. This is the second flare in 2 weeks. His concern was warranted. While my overall disease progression remained classified as mild, the increasing frequency of symptomatic episodes suggested my current treatment protocol might need adjustment. "I'll come in first thing tomorrow," I agreed. "And Eleanor," he added, his tone shifting slightly. "Don't dismiss these warning signs. Physician, heal thyself doesn't work with autoimmune conditions." The gentle admonishment reminded me of our altered relationship. Thomas was now both colleague and physician, navigating the same challenging dual perspective I was experiencing as doctor-turned-patient. "Understood, doctor," I replied with light-hearted formality. "The patient will comply with medical advice." His chuckle carried through the phone line. "If only all my patients were so agreeable. See you tomorrow." That evening, as I reviewed the day's events from the comfort of my living room sofa, I considered how publicly acknowledging my condition had unexpectedly advanced the advocacy program's goals. My MS flare during the committee meeting had transformed abstract concepts about patient experience into visible reality for my colleagues. Harold's subsequent sharing of his own Parkinson's journey had further humanized the physician as patient perspective. There was power in this vulnerability, not despite my diagnosis, but because of it. The very circumstances Marcus had suggested might undermine my credibility were actually enhancing my effectiveness in building bridges between medical providers and patients. My follow-up appointment with Thomas the next morning confirmed what we both suspected. The current medication wasn't adequately controlling my disease activity. He recommended a more aggressive treatment approach, explaining the benefits and potential side effects with the careful precision I'd always appreciated in his clinical reasoning. "The good news is we have multiple options," he explained, displaying imaging that showed comparison scans of my brain. "And caught early enough, we can significantly slow progression." I studied the scans with the detached interest of a neurologist overlaid with the personal investment of a patient. Another example of the dual perspective that now colored all my medical interactions. "I trust your recommendation," I said finally. "Let's proceed with the new protocol." As Thomas updated my prescription and scheduled follow-up testing, he asked about the advocacy program. I shared the latest developments, including the patient consultant panel concept and James Wilson's unexpected interest in addressing diagnostic bias. "You've accomplished more in 3 weeks than most new initiatives manage in 3 months," Thomas observed, "though I'm concerned about the pace you're maintaining." "Hence today's appointment," I acknowledged ruefully. "I'm learning to balance better." Harold actually provided some valuable perspective on transforming rather than merely adapting to health challenges. Thomas smiled. "Harold has always been wise. His mentorship shaped many of us." He closed my file and removed his clinical white coat, symbolically transitioning from physician to friend. "Now, as promised, dinner tonight? There's a new place near the lake with excellent reviews." I hesitated, suddenly aware of a shift in our interaction, something warming beyond professional collegiality or even friendship. "I'd like that. But Thomas, I should be clear about something. My life is complicated right now in ways that might not be fair to bring into someone else's world." He held my gaze steadily. "Eleanor, I've known you for 20 years. I've respected you as a colleague, valued you as a friend, and now have the privilege of contributing to your healthcare. None of those connections is diminished by your diagnosis. Quite the opposite." His words dispelled the unspoken concern that had been hovering at the edges of my consciousness, that my condition might render me somehow less viable as a friend, colleague, or potentially something more. It was the same insidious doubt that had momentarily surfaced during Marcus's insinuations about my professional choices. "Dinner would be lovely," I said, finding myself looking forward to an evening beyond the hospital walls. As I left Thomas's office, I checked my phone to find several messages waiting. Diane confirming budget approval for the patient consultant panel, Sophia sending additional education material prototypes, and surprisingly, a voice message from Marcus asking to meet privately about a personal matter. The last message gave me pause. Despite our professional history, Marcus and I had never been particularly close, and our recent interactions had been strained by his barely concealed skepticism about the advocacy program. What personal matter could he possibly want to discuss? Curiosity won out. I returned his call and arranged to meet him that afternoon in the hospital cafeteria, a deliberately public setting that offered both privacy of conversation and the safety of surrounding colleagues. Marcus was already waiting when I arrived, 2 coffees on the table before him. He looked uncharacteristically subdued, the usual confident demeanor replaced by something more hesitant. "Thank you for meeting me," he began as I took the seat across from him. "I owe you an apology for my comments about your advocacy program. They were unprofessional and, frankly, unkind." The admission surprised me. What prompted this change of heart? He stared into his coffee for a long moment before responding. "My wife, Catherine, has been experiencing symptoms for months: fatigue, cognitive issues, peripheral numbness. Sound familiar?" My stomach tightened with recognition. MS symptoms. That's my suspicion. But she's been to 3 different doctors, and they've all dismissed her concerns as stress, perimenopause, even suggested antidepressants. His voice took on an edge of bitter irony. Apparently, I needed to witness it happening to someone. I love before I could recognize how dismissive I've been with my own patients. The parallels to my experience, and Sophia's, were striking. Has she been properly evaluated yet? Imaging? Spinal fluid analysis? That's actually why I wanted to speak with you. I'm too close to the situation to be objective, and I don't fully trust our colleagues to take her symptoms seriously. He looked up, vulnerability evident in his expression. Would you consider consulting on her case? Not as her physician, but as someone who understands this from both sides. The request was unexpected but deeply meaningful, a recognition of the unique value of my dual perspective that transcended our professional rivalry. "Of course," I agreed without hesitation. "I'd be happy to help." Catherine Reed sat across from me in the small consultation room adjacent to my office, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She was a striking woman in her mid-40s with intelligent eyes and a composed demeanor that only occasionally betrayed the anxiety beneath. Marcus had introduced us, then excused himself, a decision we had agreed upon to ensure Catherine could speak freely without her husband's medical expertise or personal concerns influencing the conversation. "Marcus tells me you've been experiencing some troubling symptoms," I began gently. "Would you mind describing them to me in your own words?" She exhaled slowly, as if finally permitted to release a breath she'd been holding for months. "It started with fatigue, not normal tiredness, but a bone-deep exhaustion that sleep doesn't touch. Then numbness in my hands and feet, intermittent at first, now almost constant on my left side. My thinking gets cloudy sometimes. I'll be in the middle of a sentence and suddenly can't find basic words." I nodded, listening carefully. "And how have your previous medical consultations gone?" A flash of frustration crossed her face. "The first doctor said it was just stress, suggested meditation and better sleep hygiene. The second focused on my age, said perimenopause causes all sorts of vague symptoms and I should just wait it out. The third prescribed antidepressants without even ordering basic blood work." She leaned forward slightly. "Dr. Mitchell, I'm an architectural engineer. I manage complex projects with hundreds of variables. I know the difference between being stressed and something being wrong with my body." Her articulate self-advocacy reminded me of my own determination in James Wilson's office months earlier. "I believe you," I said simply. "And given your symptoms, a neurological workup is absolutely warranted." Relief washed over her face, the universal response of patients who finally feel heard after repeated dismissals. Marcus wanted to evaluate me himself, but I refused. Too complicated emotionally, and I worried he might either miss something because he's too close or imagine problems because he's worried. That was wise, I agreed. Even the most brilliant physicians struggle with objectivity when treating loved ones. I opened my laptop, pulling up a template for neurological assessment. Let's start with a detailed symptom history, then discuss next steps for proper evaluation. For the next hour, I conducted a thorough consultation, not as Catherine's physician of record, but as an experienced neurologist helping navigate a complex medical situation. We documented her symptoms with precise timelines, identified exacerbating factors, and discussed potential diagnostic pathways. By session's end, we had developed a comprehensive plan: referral to Thomas Chen for formal neurological evaluation, specific imaging requests that would target areas of concern, and laboratory testing focused on inflammatory and autoimmune markers. "What do you think it is?" Catherine asked directly as our consultation concluded. "Marcus hasn't said it explicitly, but I can tell he's concerned about MS. I chose my words carefully. Your symptoms are consistent with several neurological conditions, including MS. But it would be premature to focus on any specific diagnosis before proper testing. What matters is that you're finally getting the comprehensive evaluation you should have received months ago." As Catherine gathered her things to leave, she hesitated. "Marcus mentioned you were recently diagnosed with MS yourself, that it's part of why you started the patient advocacy program." "That's right," I confirmed, seeing no reason to hide what had become common knowledge within the hospital. "Does it help?" she asked quietly. "Having a name for what's happening? To you, even if it's a difficult diagnosis." The question struck me with its poignancy. "Yes," I answered honestly. "There's power in knowing what you're fighting, even when the battle is challenging. Uncertainty can be more debilitating than diagnosis." After Catherine left, I completed my consultation notes and sent the recommended referrals to Thomas, marking them as high priority. As I worked, a notification appeared on my computer. The hospital board had approved funding for the patient consultant panel, with authorization to hire 3 part-time consultants as a pilot program. The accompanying note from Diane was brief, but triumphant. They didn't just approve it, they doubled the requested budget. Harold was very persuasive. This unexpected victory energized me, temporarily pushing aside the fatigue that had been shadowing me throughout the day. I immediately called Sophia to offer her the first consultant position, which she accepted with enthusiasm. We arranged to meet the following day to discuss additional candidates and implementation timeline. By late afternoon, my energy was waning. Noticeably, a familiar pattern as my MS symptoms typically intensified with fatigue. I had just decided to finish my remaining paperwork at home when my office phone rang. It was the hospital's public relations director, Lisa Montgomery. "Dr. Mitchell, I hope I'm not interrupting," she began briskly. "I'm calling because we've received a media inquiry about your patient advocacy program. The Glenwood Gazette is doing a feature on innovative healthcare initiatives, and they're particularly interested in your dual perspective as physician and patient." The request took me by surprise. While I had imagined the program might eventually generate positive publicity for Lakeside, I hadn't anticipated media interest so soon, or with such specific focus on my personal medical situation. "What exactly are they looking to highlight?" I asked cautiously. "They want to interview you about how your MS diagnosis informs your approach to patient advocacy. It's potentially excellent exposure for the program and Lakeside generally." She paused briefly. "Of course, how much of your personal health journey you share would be entirely up to you." I found myself torn between professional opportunity and personal privacy. The program could certainly benefit from positive media coverage, potentially attracting both institutional support and patient participation, but discussing my diagnosis publicly would irrevocably shift how I was perceived, both within the medical community and beyond. "Can I consider this overnight?" I asked. "It's not a simple decision." "Of course," Lisa replied. "They'd need An answer by tomorrow afternoon to make next week's healthcare section. After we hung up, I sat at my desk, contemplating this unexpected development. Throughout my medical career, I had maintained clear boundaries between professional and personal, always the physician, never the patient. Even now, as I navigated both worlds simultaneously, I had carefully controlled how much of my health status I revealed and to whom. A public interview would dissolve those boundaries completely. Once my diagnosis became public knowledge beyond hospital walls, it would forever color how people saw me. Colleagues, future patients, community members. Would it undermine my professional authority or enhance my credibility as an advocate? Would it define me in ways I wasn't prepared to? Be defined? I was still weighing these questions when Thomas called to confirm our dinner plans. "Still on for tonight?" he asked. "I made reservations at Lakeview Bistro for 7. "Looking forward to it," I replied, then hesitated before adding, "Thomas, I could use your perspective on something. The hospital PR department wants me to do an interview about the advocacy program, specifically focusing on how my MS diagnosis shapes my approach." "Ah," he said, understanding immediately. "The personal becoming public. How do you feel about that?" "Conflicted. It could significantly benefit the program, but once that information is public, it becomes part of your professional identity in ways you can't control," he finished for me. "We can discuss it tonight if you'd like." By the time I arrived at Lakeview Bistro that evening, I had mentally rehearsed the pros and cons of the interview request dozens of times without reaching a clear conclusion. The restaurant was situated on a bluff overlooking Glenwood Lake, with floor-to-ceiling windows capturing the spectacular sunset over the water. Thomas was already seated at a corner table that offered both privacy and a panoramic view. He rose to greet me, his customary professional demeanor softened by the informal setting. "You look wonderful," he said, his genuine warmth evident. "How are you feeling?" "Better than this morning," I replied honestly. "The new medication seems to be helping with the intermittent vision issues, though the fatigue is still challenging." "Give it time," he advised as we settled into our seats. Most patients notice gradual improvement in fatigue management over the first few weeks. As we ordered drinks and appetizers, our conversation flowed easily from hospital updates to mutual colleagues to recent advances in neurology research. It struck me how naturally we transitioned between professional and personal topics, a reflection of our long history together, as well as the evolving nature of our relationship. Over the main course, Thomas brought up the interview question. "Have you decided about the Gazette piece?" "Not yet," I admitted. "There's so much potential benefit for the advocacy program, but I'm hesitant to become the doctor with MS, rather than simply a neurologist who happens to have MS." Thomas considered this thoughtfully. "I imagine it's similar to how I felt when I first started openly discussing being gay in medical circles. There was always the risk of becoming the gay neurologist, rather than just a neurologist who happens to be gay." His comparison surprised me, not because I didn't know Thomas was gay, I had known for years, but because he rarely referenced it in professional contexts. "How did you navigate that balance?" I asked. "Imperfectly," he acknowledged with a slight smile. "But I eventually realized that visibility matters. When medical students or residents see someone like them in leadership positions, whether it's related to sexuality, gender, race, or health status, it changes what they believe is possible for themselves." "This is different, though," I countered. "A neurologist with MS is dealing with a condition that affects the very organ system she specializes in treating." "True. But consider how powerful that makes your perspective. You understand both the clinical presentation and the lived experience in ways few can claim." He leaned forward slightly. "Eleanor, whatever you decide should be based on your comfort level. But don't underestimate how meaningful your transparency could be for patients struggling with similar diagnoses, or for physicians who may face health challenges of their own someday." His perspective shifted something in my thinking. Throughout my career, I had valued clinical objectivity and professional distance, but perhaps there was equal value in informed empathy and personal connection. The very qualities that had made the patient advocacy program resonant with both patients and healthcare providers. "Thank you," I said sincerely. "That helps clarify things." As dinner concluded and we lingered over coffee, our conversation drifted to topics further from medicine: books we'd recently read, music we enjoyed, places we hoped to visit. I found myself more relaxed than I had been in months, temporarily unburdened from the dual identities of physician and patient that now structured my days. When Thomas walked me to my car in the restaurant parking lot, he hesitated briefly before speaking. "I've enjoyed this evening tremendously," he said. "And I'd like to suggest we do it again, not as colleagues discussing hospital matters or as doctor and patient reviewing treatment protocols, but simply as Eleanor and Thomas, two people who enjoy each other's company." His clear articulation of interest was both flattering and slightly alarming. Since my diagnosis, I had unconsciously placed certain aspects of my life, including romantic possibilities, on indefinite hold, as if MS had rendered them temporarily irrelevant or permanently unattainable. "Thomas, I'm not sure that's wise," I began carefully. "My life is complicated right now in ways that make you no less compelling as a person," he interrupted gently. "Eleanor, I've respected you professionally for 2 decades. I've valued your friendship for nearly as long. Those feelings haven't diminished with your diagnosis. If anything, seeing your courage and adaptability has only deepened my admiration." His words disarmed my prepared objections. How long had I used my medical condition as a shield against vulnerability in other areas of my life? How many opportunities for connection had I preemptively dismissed? "I'd like that," I found myself saying. "Dinner as Eleanor and Thomas sounds wonderful." The smile that crossed his face was worth any uncertainty I felt. We made plans for the following weekend: a concert at the Lakeside Pavilion, deliberately, distant from the hospital both physically and atmospherically. The next morning, I called Lisa Montgomery and agreed to the Gazette interview with one condition. I would discuss my experience as a physician navigating life with MS, but the primary focus must remain on the patient advocacy program and its goals. She readily agreed, and we scheduled the interview for the following week. That decision made, I turned my attention to developing the patient consultant panel. Sophia had already compiled a list of potential candidates: patients with various conditions who had demonstrated both insight into their healthcare experiences and constructive approaches to addressing systemic issues. The key is finding people who can translate their personal frustrations into actionable feedback, Sophia explained during our planning meeting. "We need consultants who can identify problems without getting stuck in grievances." Her assessment aligned perfectly with my vision for the panel. "What about diversity of experiences?" I asked. "We should ensure representation across different demographics and health conditions." "Already factored that in," she confirmed, displaying a spreadsheet that categorized candidates by age, gender, socioeconomic status, and medical conditions. "I've highlighted my top recommendations in each category." As we reviewed the candidates, I was struck by Sophia's organizational skills and strategic thinking. "You know, this role could become more than just consulting," I observed. "Have you considered taking on program coordination? We have budget for a part-time position." She looked up surprised. "Are you offering me a job?" "Essentially, yes. You have the perfect combination of personal experience and professional capabilities. The position would involve coordinating the consultant panel, developing communication materials, and helping bridge the gap between patient needs and institutional perspectives." Her expression shifted from surprise to thoughtful consideration. "My health has made consistent full-time work challenging, but a flexible part-time role focused on making healthcare better for people like me." She smiled. "When can I start?" With Sophia's acceptance, another piece of the advocacy program fell into place. Over the following days, we conducted interviews with consultant candidates, developed framework documents for the program's operation, and scheduled the first official panel meeting. Concurrently, I prepared for the Gazette interview, carefully considering how to discuss my diagnosis in ways that would support the program's mission without overshadowing it. Thomas offered valuable perspective during our evening phone conversations, which had become a welcome daily ritual. Focus on the transferable insights, he suggested. How has being a patient changed your understanding of effective healthcare? What have you learned that other physicians might benefit from knowing? His framing helped me approach the interview as an educational opportunity rather than a personal disclosure. By the time journalist Maya Patel arrived at my office, I felt reasonably prepared, though still slightly apprehensive about publicly discussing aspects of my health I had previously kept private. Maya was younger than I expected, perhaps in her early 30s, with a keen intelligence evident in her precise questions and attentive note-taking. She began with standard inquiries about the advocacy program's structure and goals, gradually transitioning to more personal territory. Dr. Mitchell, you've had a distinguished career in neurology, she noted, referencing her research notes. What prompted your shift to patient advocacy work? I provided the explanation I had carefully crafted. After taking time away to care for my parents, I gained perspective on how challenging our healthcare system can be to navigate, even for someone with medical training. The advocacy program grew from recognizing that gap between provider intentions and patient experiences. She nodded, then asked the question I had been anticipating. And how has your own experience with multiple sclerosis influenced your approach to this work? Though prepared, I still felt a moment of vulnerability as I acknowledged publicly what had previously been private. My diagnosis provided insights I couldn't have gained otherwise, I explained. As a neurologist, I understood MS clinically. As a patient, I've learned how it feels to have symptoms dismissed, to navigate complex treatment decisions, and to recalibrate your identity around a new health reality. Could you share a specific example of how your dual perspective has shaped the advocacy program? Maya prompted. I considered briefly before responding. When developing our physician communication training, I incorporated something I experienced firsthand, the difference between being heard and being merely listened to. Many doctors listen attentively, but still filter patient concerns through their own preconceptions. True hearing requires suspending those filters temporarily, which is much harder than it sounds. The interview continued for nearly an hour, striking a balance between program details and personal insights that felt appropriate if occasionally uncomfortable. As we concluded, Maya asked one final question that caught me slightly off guard. Dr. Mitchell, what would you say to physicians who might someday find themselves on the patient side of healthcare? The question resonated deeply, touching on transformations I was still processing myself. I would tell them that becoming a patient doesn't diminish their medical knowledge or professional identity, I answered carefully. But it will likely reveal blind spots in how they've practiced medicine. Moments where efficiency trumped empathy, or where clinical algorithms overshadowed individual experiences. And I would suggest they allow that revelation to make them more effective physicians, not less confident ones. Maya smiled as she closed her notebook. That's powerful perspective. Thank you for your candor. After she left, I sat quietly. In my office, processing the vulnerability of having shared my medical status with someone who would now craft it into public narrative. There was no retracting the disclosure, no controlling exactly how my words would be presented or received. Yet alongside the discomfort, I felt an unexpected lightness, as if acknowledgement had somehow diminished the weight of secrecy. The article was scheduled to appear the following Sunday. In the interim, the advocacy program continued to develop momentum. The patient consultant panel held its first official meeting. Department liaisons began implementing communication protocols, we had developed, and James Wilson's Diagnostic Bias Initiative garnered interest from physicians across multiple specialties. Equally significant were developments in Catherine Reed's case. Thomas had expedited her evaluation, confirming what Marcus and I had suspected. She was indeed showing early signs of multiple sclerosis. The diagnosis, while difficult, allowed her to begin appropriate treatment promptly, potentially altering her disease course for the better. Marcus approached me in the hospital cafeteria several days after Catherine's diagnosis was confirmed. "I owe you a debt I can't repay," he said, the usual competitive edge in his manner completely absent. "If you hadn't agreed to consult, if you hadn't pushed for comprehensive testing—" "Catherine did the hard part," I reminded him. "She advocated for herself despite repeated dismissals. She knew something was wrong and persisted until someone listened." "But that someone was you." He shook his head slightly. "The irony isn't lost on me that the colleague I've been quietly competing with for years is the one who helped my wife when I couldn't. Professional rivalry and personal support aren't mutually exclusive," I observed. "How is Catherine doing with the news?" "Better than I am, honestly. She says having a diagnosis feels like solid ground after months of quicksand. She's already researching clinical trials and support groups." A hint of his usual confidence returned. "She'd like to meet with you again, actually. Said you understand? Things the rest of us can only approximate." His acknowledgement of the unique value of my dual perspective affirmed the decision I had made about the Gazette interview. There was power in openness, in allowing my professional and personal experiences to inform each other visibly, rather than maintaining artificial separation. The Sunday the article was published, I woke early, both eager and apprehensive to see how Maya had presented my story. The physical newspaper waited on my doorstep, delivered by a neighborhood teenager I paid monthly for the service, one of the small-town traditions I maintained despite digital alternatives. The advocacy program feature appeared prominently in the healthcare section, accompanied by a professional photograph of me in my office, Sophia's Trust Your Instincts mug visible on the desk beside me. The headline read, "The Doctor Becomes the Patient: How One Physician's MS Diagnosis is Transforming Patient Care at Lakeside." As I read through the article, I was relieved to find Maya had handled the material with sensitivity and accuracy. She had captured the program's objectives clearly while weaving in elements of my personal experience that illuminated rather than sensationalized. The final paragraphs highlighted the patient consultant panel and quoted Harold on the institutional commitment to improving patient experiences. What I hadn't anticipated was the sidebar accompanying the main article, a short piece titled, "When Doctors Don't Listen: Warning Signs. Your Symptoms Are Being Dismissed." It featured quotes from both Sophia and James Wilson about common patterns of medical dismissal and offered practical advice for patients facing similar situations. I was still processing my reactions to the article when my phone began chiming with incoming messages. The first was from Thomas. "Thoughtful piece that captures your vision beautifully. Coffee later to discuss." Diane's message followed. "PR. Department already fielding calls from other hospitals interested in our advocacy model. You've started something important, Eleanor." Then came texts from former colleagues, friends, and unexpectedly, several patients I had treated years earlier, who recognized me from the article. Each message expressed support, many sharing personal stories of medical dismissal or difficult diagnoses. The most surprising response came from James Wilson. "Just read the Gazette piece. Your willingness to be vulnerable about your diagnosis gives me courage to be equally transparent about my own biases and learning process. The sidebar has already prompted several patients to request more comprehensive evaluations this morning. This is how change happens." His message captured perfectly what I had hoped the article might accomplish. Not personal recognition, but systemic awareness that could improve care for patients beyond those directly involved with the advocacy program. As responses continued, throughout the day, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had led to this moment. 6 months earlier, I had sat in James Wilson's office, frustrated and diminished as he dismissed my symptoms as just aging. That dismissal, painful as it had been, had ultimately catalyzed not only my proper diagnosis and treatment, but an entire institutional initiative that was now generating interest beyond Lakeside's walls. I thought about Catherine Reed, beginning her treatment with the advantage of early diagnosis that might significantly impact her long-term prognosis. About Sophia, whose professional skills were now being channeled into work that valued her patient perspective, rather than dismissing it. About the patient consultant panel members, whose lived experiences were being recognized as expertise rather than anecdote. What had begun as a personal medical crisis had transformed into something with far broader implications, a reimagining of how medical expertise and patient experience might complement rather than oppose each other. The boundaries between doctor and patient, between professional and personal, had not disappeared but had become more permeable, allowing insights to flow in both directions. That evening, as Thomas and I walked along the lakeshore discussing reactions to the article, he asked a question that gave me pause. If you could go back to that first appointment with James Wilson, would you handle it differently? Would you have revealed your medical credentials immediately rather than experiencing that dismissal? I considered carefully before answering. No, I said finally. As painful as that dismissal was, it showed me something I might never have truly understood otherwise. Sometimes you have to experience the problem to recognize the solution. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. The transformation rather than mere adaptation that Harold mentioned. Exactly. I smiled, watching the sunset reflect across the lake's surface. Sometimes the most valuable perspective comes from standing in two worlds simultaneously. 6 months after the Gazette article was published, I stood at a podium in the Lakeside Medical Center auditorium, surveying a packed room of medical professionals, hospital administrators, and patient advocates from across the state. The quarterly meeting of our now-established patient advocacy program had expanded far beyond its original scope. What began as a small initiative within one hospital had evolved into a regional collaborative that drew participants from healthcare systems throughout the Northeast. Welcome, everyone, I began, my voice steady despite the flutter of nervous energy I still felt before public speaking. Today marks our second regional summit on patient-centered care reform. I'm particularly pleased to see so many new faces joining us, both medical providers and patient consultants. From my elevated position at the podium, I could identify familiar faces throughout the audience. Sophia sat in the front row beside the other members of our patient consultant panel, which had expanded to include 12 individuals with diverse medical conditions and backgrounds. James Wilson was positioned near the center aisle, his notepad, already covered with his characteristically meticulous notes. Thomas occupied his usual seat at the back, close enough to offer silent support, distant enough to maintain professional boundaries in public settings. Our agenda today includes presentations from 3 hospital systems that have implemented variations of our advocacy model, followed by a panel discussion with patients who have directly experienced the impact of these programs. I gestured toward the presentation screen behind me. But before we begin, I'd like to share some preliminary data on the outcomes we're seeing at Lakeside since implementation. The figures that appeared on the screen represented 6 months of careful documentation and analysis, metrics that translated human experiences into the quantifiable evidence healthcare administrators required for continued support. A 37% reduction in formal complaints about provider communication, a 24% increase in patient-reported satisfaction with treatment plan comprehension, and perhaps most significantly, a 19% decrease in misdiagnosis rates for conditions frequently dismissed as psychosomatic or age-related. These numbers matter, I acknowledged, but equally important are the stories behind them. the individual experiences of patients whose healthcare journeys have been transformed through proper acknowledgement, comprehensive evaluation, and collaborative treatment planning. As I continued my opening remarks, I found myself reflecting on my own journey over the past year. My MS had stabilized with the adjusted treatment protocol Thomas had recommended, though I still experienced occasional flares triggered by overexertion or stress. I had developed effective management strategies for the fatigue that remained my most persistent symptom, structuring my work schedule around my energy patterns and prioritizing rest as diligently as I once prioritized additional hospital rounds. The patient advocacy program had flourished beyond our initial projections, attracting institutional support, grant funding, and professional recognition. Harold's early endorsement had opened doors throughout the medical establishment, while Diane's administrative expertise had transformed theoretical concepts into practical implementations. The patient consultant panel, under Sophia's skilled coordination, had become an invaluable resource not only for Lakeside, but for other hospitals seeking to develop similar initiatives. Most remarkably, James Wilson had emerged as one of the program's most dedicated champions. His diagnostic bias initiative had expanded into a comprehensive training module now being implemented in medical residency programs affiliated with regional teaching hospitals. His willingness to acknowledge his own past dismissiveness had created space for other physicians to examine their practices without defensive posturing. Today's first presentation comes from Dr. James Wilson, I announced, completing my introduction. His work on recognizing and addressing diagnostic bias has become a cornerstone of our program's physician education component. As James approached the podium, I stepped aside, taking my seat in the front row beside Sophia. She leaned over, slightly whispering, "Hard to believe that's the same doctor who dismissed both of us." I nodded, watching as James arranged his presentation materials. His transformation from dismissive practitioner to patient advocacy champion represented everything the program aspired to achieve, not vilifying physicians who missed diagnoses, but engaging them in creating more effective diagnostic approaches. James began his presentation with characteristic directness. "I want to start by acknowledging that I was part of the problem this initiative addresses. I routinely dismissed symptoms in certain patient demographics, particularly women over 40, attributing their complaints to stress, hormonal changes, or normal aging without adequate investigation." His candor set the tone for the presentations that followed, each highlighting specific improvements in patient-provider communication and diagnostic protocols. By mid-morning, when we broke for a scheduled intermission, the energy in the room was palpable. Medical professionals and patient representatives engaged in animated conversations that bridged traditional hierarchical divides. I was heading toward the refreshment area when Marcus intercepted me, Catherine at his side. She looked remarkably well, the benefits of early intervention evident in her steady gait and clear-eyed alertness. "Eleanor," Catherine greeted me, warmly, "your opening presentation was excellent. Those outcome metrics are even better than I'd anticipated when we discussed preliminary data last month." In addition to managing her own MS treatment, Catherine had become actively involved with the advocacy program, lending her analytical skills to our outcomes assessment team. Her background in architectural engineering brought valuable perspective to our data visualization efforts, transforming complex statistics into accessible graphics that resonated with both medical professionals and lay people. "The credit belongs to everyone implementing these changes daily," I responded. "How are you feeling? The new medication protocol working well?" "Better than expected," she confirmed. "The fatigue is manageable most days, and the cognitive symptoms have diminished significantly." She smiled at Marcus. "Though I still outsource certain household calculations to the resident mathematician." Marcus's transformation over the past months had been as remarkable as James's, though different in nature. Where James had become a public advocate for systemic change, Marcus had undergone a more personal evolution, from competitive colleague to supportive spouse and increasingly valued collaborator. His neurological expertise remained exceptional, but it was now tempered with humility born from witnessing his wife's diagnostic journey. The preliminary results from the diagnostic reconsideration protocol are encouraging, he told me, referring to a procedure he had developed that triggered automatic reevaluation of certain symptom patterns, frequently misattributed to psychological causes. 3 confirmed autoimmune diagnoses already in patients previously labeled with somatoform disorder. Our conversation was interrupted by Lisa Montgomery from Hospital Public Relations, tablet in hand and expression urgent. Dr. Mitchell, sorry to interrupt, but I've just received word that WGLN News wants to feature the advocacy program on their evening health segment tomorrow. They're specifically requesting an interview with you and one of the patient consultants. The request wasn't entirely surprising. Media interest had steadily increased since the Gazette article, but the timing was challenging given the summit schedule. Could we postpone until next week when the summit concludes? Lisa shook her head apologetically. They're doing a special series on healthcare innovation all this week. Tomorrow's segment is specifically on patient advocacy. I glanced at Sophia, who had joined our group midway through this conversation. What do you think? Would you be comfortable representing the patient perspective? Absolutely, she agreed without hesitation. This program exists because people like us were willing to speak up about being dismissed. The more visibility for these issues, the better. Her readiness reminded me how far we had both come from our first conversation in my living room, when she had nervously presented me with that now iconic ceramic mug. The woman standing before me now, confident in her dual expertise as both patient and program coordinator, embodied the transformation possible when healthcare systems recognize the value of lived experience. As Lisa departed with confirmation of our availability, Harold approached our group, his movements showing the subtle hesitation characteristic of his well-managed Parkinson's. At 73, he remained a commanding presence despite his condition. Respected, not despite his health challenges, but partly because of how he navigated them with transparency and dignity. The executive committee just finished reviewing the advocacy program's budget projections for next fiscal year, he announced without preamble. They've approved full funding plus the expansion proposals for the regional collaborative. This news represented a significant victory, institutional commitment that would sustain the program beyond individual champions or grant cycles. That's excellent, I responded, genuinely pleased. The regional model has shown promising preliminary results. There's more, Harold continued. The committee is establishing a permanent associate chief medical officer position focusing on patient experience and advocacy. They'd like you to consider taking the role. The offer caught me completely by surprise. I had been focused on developing and implementing the advocacy program, not on pursuing administrative advancement. That's unexpected, I managed to reply. But appropriate, Harold countered. This initiative has demonstrated tangible improvements in patient outcomes and provider effectiveness. Elevating it to executive level ensures its principles become permanently integrated into institutional practice rather than remaining a supplemental program. The position he described would involve broader authority than my current role, the ability to implement patient-centered reforms across departments and influence institutional policies at the highest levels. It was an opportunity I couldn't have imagined when I first stepped into James Wilson's office as a patient with dismissed symptoms. I'd like to discuss the details before making a decision, I said carefully. Harold nodded, understanding. Of course, we can meet after today's sessions conclude. He glanced at his watch. Speaking of which, we should return to the auditorium. The patient panel is scheduled to begin shortly. As attendees filtered back to their seats, I found myself seated between Sophia and Thomas, who had joined us during the intermission. The patient panel consisted of 6 individuals who had experienced medical dismissal before benefiting from advocacy program interventions. their stories forming a powerful counterpoint to the data-driven presentations that had preceded them. "I went to 4 different doctors over 3 years," one panelist explained. "Each one told me my symptoms were due to anxiety, suggested therapy or antidepressants, and sent me home. It wasn't until I connected with the advocacy program that someone finally ordered the tests that diagnosed my autoimmune disorder." Another panelist described the cognitive dissonance of knowing something was wrong, while medical professionals repeatedly insisted otherwise. "You start to doubt your own perceptions. Maybe it is all in your head. Maybe you are just getting older." The gaslighting becomes almost more debilitating than the physical symptoms. Their testimonies reflected experiences I now understood from both professional and personal perspectives. The frustration of having legitimate concerns dismissed, the relief of finally being heard, the complex emotions surrounding delayed diagnosis. As I listened, I felt Thomas's hand briefly touch mine beneath the conference table, a gesture of support and shared understanding that carried meaning beyond words. When the formal sessions concluded late that afternoon, the auditorium gradually emptied as attendees departed for scheduled networking events elsewhere in the hospital. I remained behind, organizing materials from the presentations while processing Harold's unexpected job offer. "Quite a successful day," Thomas observed, helping me gather scattered handouts. The regional participation exceeded even Diane's optimistic projections. "It's encouraging," I agreed. "Though expansion brings logistical challenges we're still figuring out how to address." "Speaking of expansion," Thomas said casually, "Harold mentioned the Associate Chief Medical Officer position. Are you considering it?" I paused, organizing my thoughts. It's a significant opportunity to institutionalize the principles we've been advocating. But I'm not sure I want to move further into administration. I've valued the direct engagement with patients and providers that my current role allows. Thomas nodded understanding. The eternal dilemma in healthcare reform, implementing change from within the system versus maintaining the perspective that comes from closer proximity to patients. His framing captured precisely what I had been struggling to articulate. Exactly. As Associate Chief Medical Officer, I'd have more authority to implement policies, but potentially less connection to the experiences those policies are meant to address. Perhaps the solution isn't either-or, Thomas suggested. Harold created this position specifically with you in mind, someone who bridges clinical expertise and patient experience. The role could be structured to maintain that connection while expanding your influence. His perspective, as always, offered clarity without pressure. Over the month since my diagnosis, our relationship had evolved into something neither of us had initially anticipated, a partnership that encompassed professional collaboration, mutual respect, and increasingly deep personal connection. We had navigated the complexities of his dual role as both my treating neurologist and romantic partner by establishing clear boundaries and open communication. I should at least discuss the possibilities with Harold before declining, I conceded. The position could potentially advance the advocacy work in ways my current role cannot. As we completed gathering the conference materials, my phone chimed with a message from Sophia. "Panel members asking if you'll join us for dinner at Riverside to celebrate today's success. Thomas, welcome too." I smiled at the invitation. The distinction between medical professionals and patient advocates had blurred significantly within our core team. Another sign of the cultural shift the program sought to create more broadly. Thomas and I joined the dinner gathering at Riverside Restaurant, where conversation flowed easily between clinical updates, program developments, and personal milestones. Halfway through the meal, one of the patient panelists raised her glass in an impromptu toast. "To Dr. Mitchell," she said warmly, who turned her own medical dismissal into a movement that's helping countless patients be heard. The sentiment, though kindly meant, made me slightly uncomfortable. The personalization of what had always been a collaborative effort. "To all of us," I countered, raising my own glass. Medical providers willing to examine their practices, patients brave, enough to share their experiences, and administrators supporting institutional change. This program succeeds because of everyone at this table and many who aren't. Later that evening, as Thomas walked me to my car, we discussed the Associate Chief Medical Officer position further. "Whatever you decide," he said thoughtfully. "Consider how the role might evolve as your own health needs change over time." His gentle reference to the progressive nature of MS, a reality we both acknowledged without allowing it to dominate our interactions, reflected the pragmatic compassion I had come to value deeply in our relationship. "That's part of my consideration," I admitted. "The current role already requires careful energy management. A higher administrative position would bring different demands, potentially more sustainable as my condition progresses." "Just remember that adaptation isn't surrender," Thomas said, echoing Harold's earlier wisdom about transformation versus adaptation. "It's strategic resource allocation." I smiled at his framing. Ever the neurologist, viewing everything through the lens of neural efficiency. "Professional hazard," he acknowledged with a matching smile, "but the principle applies universally." The following morning, I met with Harold in his office to discuss the Associate Chief Medical Officer position in detail. He had prepared comprehensive documentation outlining the role's responsibilities, reporting structure, and strategic objectives. This position would oversee not just the advocacy program, but broader patient experience initiatives across all departments, he explained. "You'd have authority to implement policy changes, allocate resources, and establish institutional priorities related to patient engagement and communication." As we discussed specific aspects of the role, it became clear that Harold had indeed envisioned a position that would capitalize on my unique perspective while accommodating the realities of managing a chronic condition. "The schedule would be structured around your treatment needs," he emphasized, "and the focus would remain on systemic improvement rather than day-to-day operations, leveraging your strategic thinking rather than requiring constant physical presence." His thoughtful approach addressed many of my initial concerns, but one question remained paramount. Would I maintain direct connection with patients and frontline providers? That relationship has been essential to the program's effectiveness. "Absolutely," Harold confirmed. "In fact, I'd consider that connection a core function of the role, ensuring executive decisions remain grounded in actual patient experiences rather than abstract metrics." By meeting's end, my perspective had shifted significantly. The position Harold described would indeed advance the advocacy work in ways my current role couldn't achieve, institutionalizing patient-centered practices at the highest organizational level while maintaining the vital connection to individual experiences that had sparked the initiative. "I'd like to accept the position," I told him, "with one condition. Sofia Garcia should be promoted to Director of the Patient Advocacy Program. She has the perfect combination of personal experience and professional capability to lead the initiative going forward." Harold smiled approvingly. "I was hoping you'd suggest that. The executive committee already included that recommendation in the transition plan." With the decision made, events moved swiftly. The WGLN News interview that afternoon became an opportunity to announce both the program's expansion and my upcoming transition to Associate Chief Medical Officer. Sophia articulated the patient perspective with eloquence born from both personal experience and growing professional confidence. This program exists because healthcare providers like Dr. Mitchell were willing to listen to patients saying, "Something is wrong," even when initial assessments suggested otherwise, she explained to the interviewer. But equally important, are patients willing to advocate persistently for proper evaluation of their symptoms. In the days following the regional summit, I worked with Harold and Diane to develop a comprehensive transition plan for my new role. The process included structuring departmental responsibilities, establishing communication protocols, and identifying key initiatives for immediate focus once the position became official. Concurrent with these professional developments, my personal health management continued. My MS remained relatively stable with occasional flares that required temporary treatment adjustments. Thomas monitored my condition with professional thoroughness, balanced by personal concern, maintaining appropriate clinical boundaries, while also supporting me as a partner. Our relationship had deepened over the months since that first dinner at Lakeview Bistro, evolving into a connection that honored both our professional histories and personal circumstances. We had found balance between independence and support, maintaining separate residences while spending increasing time in each other's company. One evening, as we sat on my porch watching summer lightning illuminate distant clouds, Thomas broached a subject we had been approaching obliquely for weeks. "I've been thinking about our living arrangements," he began carefully. "With your new position and ongoing treatment needs, it might be practical to consider consolidating households." The suggestion held practical merit beyond emotional significance. My current home, though comfortable, included stairs that had occasionally proved challenging during MS flares. Thomas's single-level condominium offered accessibility features that would accommodate potential future mobility needs. "Are you proposing shared housing as my neurologist or as my partner?" I asked, only partly teasing. "Definitely as your partner," he clarified with a smile. "Though I won't pretend the neurologist in me hasn't noticed you struggling with those stairs during flares." His honesty was refreshing, acknowledging the medical realities without allowing them to overshadow the personal connection that had become increasingly central to both our lives. "I've been considering similar practical arrangements," I admitted. "But I want to be certain we're making this decision for the right reasons, not just medical convenience or pragmatic accommodation." Thomas turned to face me directly, his expression serious. "Eleanor, I'm suggesting we live together because I love you. The practical benefits are secondary to that fundamental truth." His words, simple, direct, unambiguous, settled something within me that had remained unsettled since my diagnosis. Despite my professional accomplishments and the advocacy program's success, part of me had continued to question whether my health status somehow rendered me less viable as a partner. Less whole, less desirable, less worthy of unconditional love. "I love you too," I responded, the words carrying the weight of both declaration and acceptance. "And yes, consolidating households makes sense on multiple levels." We spent the remainder of the evening discussing logistics, which furniture to keep, how to merge our different living styles, when to begin the actual moving process. The practical conversation held deeper significance. We were planning a future together that acknowledged my health challenges without being defined by them. 2 weeks later, I officially assumed the role of Associate Chief Medical Officer for Patient Experience and Advocacy. My first official act was attending Sophia's installation as Director of the Patient Advocacy Program, a ceremonial transition that formalized the leadership role she had increasingly assumed in recent months. "I never imagined this outcome. When I first brought you that ceramic mug," she remarked during the small celebration following her appointment, "I just wanted to thank you for showing me it was possible to stand up to medical dismissal. Sometimes the most meaningful changes begin with the smallest gestures," I replied, genuinely proud of her growth from hesitant patient to confident program director. "Your experience has become a powerful catalyst for systemic improvement." As my first month in the new position unfolded, I found myself navigating a careful balance between executive responsibilities and continued connection with patients and frontline providers. The role demanded different skills than my previous position: more strategic thinking, broader institutional perspective, increased focus on policy development rather than direct implementation. Yet the foundation remained consistent, ensuring that patient voices influenced healthcare delivery at every level. The patient consultant panel, now under Sophia's direction, continued providing essential feedback on initiatives across departments. James Wilson's diagnostic reconsideration protocol expanded to include additional conditions frequently misattributed to psychological causes. Marcus Reed implemented specialized training for neurologists evaluating patients with complex symptom presentations. Throughout these developments, I maintained my own healthcare regimen, medication management, regular follow-up appointments, careful monitoring of symptoms and triggers. Thomas continued overseeing my neurological care, maintaining appropriate, professional boundaries during clinical appointments while supporting me personally through challenging days. Our living arrangement transition proceeded gradually, with Thomas moving into my home while we researched single-level properties that would better accommodate potential future mobility needs. The process involved practical considerations interwoven with emotional adjustment, merging two independent lives shaped by decades of individual habits and preferences. 6 weeks into my new role, Harold announced his long-anticipated retirement, effective within 6 months. The news, while expected, nonetheless marked a significant transition for Lakeside Medical Center generally, and the advocacy initiatives specifically. Harold had been instrumental in establishing institutional support for patient-centered reforms. His departure would test whether those changes had become sufficiently embedded to survive without his personal championship. The advocacy programs are your legacy, I told him during a private conversation following his announcement. Your willingness to support institutional self-examination set everything else in motion. Harold shook his head slightly. The programs are a shared legacy, begun by your courage in confronting medical dismissal, developed through collaborative effort across disciplines, and now positioned for continuation through structural integration. His framing captured the essence of what we had collectively accomplished, transforming individual experiences of healthcare inadequacy into systemic improvements that would benefit countless patients beyond those directly involved in program development. As Harold's retirement approached, planning began for a hospital-wide recognition event celebrating his contributions to Lakeside Medical Center. The organizing committee asked me to deliver remarks addressing his role in establishing the patient advocacy program and related initiatives. Preparing those remarks gave me occasion to reflect on the extraordinary journey of the past 18 months. From frustrated patient in James Wilson's office to Associate Chief Medical Officer overseeing institution-wide patient experience initiatives, the path had been neither straight nor easy, involving health challenges, professional transitions, and personal recalibrations I could never have anticipated. Yet standing at the podium during Harold's retirement ceremony, surveying the assembled hospital staff and community members, I recognized the transformative power of that unexpected journey. My diagnosis, initially experienced as loss and limitation, had ultimately expanded my professional effectiveness and personal understanding in ways no purely clinical career could have achieved. Dr. Harold Winters understood something fundamental about healthcare that many institutions still struggle to recognize. I began my remarks. He understood that medicine advances not just through technical innovation or research breakthroughs, but through honestly confronting the gaps between provider intentions and patient experiences. As I continued speaking, I saw Thomas in the audience, his presence representing the unexpected personal happiness that had emerged alongside professional evolution. Beside him sat Sophia, whose journey from dismissed patient to program director paralleled my own transformation in different ways. James Wilson and Marcus Reed were positioned nearby, their changed perspectives evidence that medical culture could indeed evolve when physicians were willing to examine their practices honestly. The patient advocacy initiatives that flourished under Harold's leadership began with a simple premise, I continued. When patients say something is wrong, they deserve to be heard. Not merely listened to, but truly heard, with suspension of preconceptions and commitment to comprehensive evaluation. I glanced down at my prepared remarks, then set them aside, speaking instead from first-hand understanding that bridged professional knowledge and personal experience. 18 months ago, I sat in a doctor's office being told that my neurological Symptoms were just aging, nothing more than the inevitable decline we all eventually face. When I revealed my medical credentials, the dismissal transformed instantly into recognition and respect. That moment crystallized something I had observed throughout my career but never fully understood: the profound impact of being heard versus being dismissed. The auditorium remained silent as I continued, every face attentive to this narrative they had heard referenced but never detailed directly. What began as a personal medical journey evolved into a systemic examination of how healthcare institutions can better serve patients, particularly those whose symptoms don't fit neat diagnostic categories or who lack the vocabulary to advocate effectively for themselves. Harold's willingness to support that examination, to allocate resources toward addressing identified gaps, made everything else possible. As I concluded my remarks celebrating Harold's contributions and vision, I found myself filled with genuine optimism about the future of patient care at Lakeside and beyond. The initiatives we had developed together would continue evolving, informed by ongoing feedback from both providers and patients. The cultural shift toward collaborative healthcare delivery had gained momentum that would sustain it beyond any individual champion. Later that evening, as Thomas and I walked along the lakeshore path that had become our favorite place for reflection, he asked a question that brought our journey full circle. If you could somehow go back and prevent that initial dismissal in James Wilson's office, if your symptoms had been immediately acknowledged and properly evaluated, would you? The question gave me pause. That moment of medical dismissal had triggered cascading consequences, personal, professional, institutional, that had fundamentally altered my life's direction. Without it, the patient advocacy program might never have existed. My relationship with Thomas might have remained purely collegial. My understanding of healthcare delivery would have remained limited to the provider perspective. No, I answered finally, with certainty that surprised even me. As painful as that dismissal was, it showed me something I couldn't have learned any other way. Sometimes you have to experience the problem to create the solution. Thomas nodded understanding. The view from both sides of the stethoscope. Exactly, I agreed, watching evening light play across the water's surface. Sometimes the most valuable perspective comes from standing in two worlds simultaneously. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.